Welcome to Grieving Insomaniacs. I am your host, Cristi Habermann. I am glad you're here. Thanks for being a part of our community. A few disclaimers before we get started. I am a licensed therapist. However, this podcast is not to be considered mental health therapy or counseling. It is for entertainment purposes only and is not associated with my counseling practice, Cristi Habermann Counseling Services. Thanks for showing up. Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. It's a cold, rainy day here in South Dakota. I'm recording a little bit early on this Sunday morning. And I wanted to talk about an episode that I had yesterday to kind of let you know what it's like years after having lost my son and grief responses. So yesterday I had gotten up early. Me and my husband are avid garage sailors. And we were at the bank when we seen a cop car go by with its red lights on. Okay. Then we see another cop car go by with its red lights on, but they drive up the street my dad lives on. And then a third cop. And I'm like, oh my God, it must be bad. And I tell my husband, we need to drive past my dad's house and make sure it's not my dad. Now, it's not rational. Granted, I didn't have my phone, but I was thinking about that too. I'm like, I don't have my phone. If they were trying to call me because something happened to my dad, he's kind of elderly. So I follow the cops. And there is a fire 2 houses from my dad's house, and the smoke is just billowing. And of course, I go into panic mode. So I call my dad. My dad says, oh, we're still in bed. I'm like, Dad, there's a fire 2 or 3 houses from your house, 2 to 3 houses from where you live. He's like, oh yeah, I see the fire trucks and stuff out there. So he gets up and he goes out there. And a couple of hours later, I call him and say, how's it going over there? And I said, is the fire still going? And then my dad's like, no, it's okay. And he said, the fire's mostly out. And I said, oh, good. I was just calling to check on you. And he was like, I thought it was a little sarcastic, saying, thanks for checking on my house. And I said, no, Dad, I'm checking on you. And we kind of hung up. And I realized that my dad does not understand how deeply the loss of my son has impacted me and how fearful I am just of life events. And I don't know how other people are when the police car goes by or the ambulance car goes by, if you go to worst case scenario, but I most certainly do. And to add a little bit of twist to it, my sister has been diagnosed with the same type of cancer that Christopher has. And I'm trying to talk to my dad about it. And I tell my dad I'm scared. Christopher lasted 6 weeks after his diagnosis. Chemotherapy killed him. My sister's insisting she's not going to do chemotherapy. I don't know what to say about it all. And my dad said, well, there's nothing to fear now. Now we don't know anything yet because we don't know what stage it is. We don't know what the treatment options are. We just don't know a lot about it. And I was just kind of looking at my dad again, thinking he doesn't understand how triggered this event has made me, how fearful I am of losing my sister in 6 weeks, and how it's activated everything that I went through with Christopher. So when I'm talking to my sister and we're talking about the procedures that she went to, like Christopher went to, she's like, oh, you have a whole different perspective on this. I'm like, yes, my son died. And then I'm looking at my dad and he has no idea what's in store for him. And I don't know how to prepare him. It's just kind of like, Dad, you have no idea what it's going to be like if you lose a child. And he is 80 this year, and I don't think he'll survive it. Like, it's just heartbreaking. So it's like, I worry that I'm going to lose both of them. 11 years was the anniversary in June. So I'm 3 months into the 12th year. And I'm still so triggered by this event that's going on in my personal life. So I just wanted to throw that out there for those of you that are still early grieving, or even those of you that are late grieving, and to let you know that I think those events, we just are forever impacted. They just always stay with us. I don't know if there's anything we can do about it. It's part of our lives now. So last week I had talked about continuing bonds and the importance of saying goodbye to the physical part of them and transitioning into a new relationship with our deceased loved ones. And I mentioned the theory continuing bonds. And I had a couple of requests from people because they wanted to know more about this. Just briefly, before the continuing bonds theory, and I go over this in great detail in my book, The Solitary Journey Through the Loss of a Child. So we had Kubler-Ross, who said we went through the 5 stages. There was someone else that said there's 4 tasks. Warden is his name. Rando said there's a process, and Parks and Bobley said that there's 4 phases. Well, the problem is that there's nothing linear about grief, just absolutely nothing. And these were presented as logical, fluid thinking processes, which you just move through easily. And I think that's the most damaging belief of all, is that you move through it easily, because I most certainly did not move through my grief easily. And as I get more and more involved in the grief community on Instagram, I realize that I am not abnormal, that a lot of people don't go through it in these phases. So does that make the people wrong, or does that make the phases wrong? Well, of course it makes the phases wrong. Because if we look at all of these people and they're all describing similar events that don't fit into these stages of grief, then we know that the stages of grief are wrong, not the people. And the reality of grief is it's messy, emotional, and life-changing. There's no way around that. And so and I wrote my book in 2015. So I had kind of talked about continuing bonds, but this book was being written at the time that I wrote my book. But I just kind of intuitively knew that I would not be able to give up my relationship to Christopher. So Dennis Glass, Phyllis Silverman, and Steven Nickman wrote a book called Continuing Bonds, A New Understanding of Grief. And they looked at the cultural traditions of other cultures. They looked at what people were saying about grief, and they said, you know what? We don't think that the stages of grief really fit into what we're seeing with grieving people. They said, we see that this idea that we're trying to force people to cut their attachment to their deceased loved ones is why people were not adapting to grief. Now, notice I didn't say getting over grief. I said adapting to grief, because it's all about adapting. We are changing our lives to incorporate a new memory of our deceased loved ones. And so they looked at all of this and they said, what we believe helps mourners the most is if we help them develop a new relationship with the deceased. And that's most certainly how I have adapted to my grief. And I just want to put this out there. I may be trained in counseling, and I may have counseled people over the years, and I still do. I'm not really practicing anymore, but I have done grief counseling. I am not a grief expert. So when I am talking to you about these things, I am talking to you as if I am a mother that lost a child, and I feel like that the regular theories of grief failed me. Modern day therapy on grief failed me. And I decided that I was going to make change by talking about these things. So when I am talking to you about this grief theory, I am talking to you as a mom who lost a child and why this works for me. Okay, it's not that I am this expert and I have all of this knowledge, and if you follow what I say, you are going to all of a sudden become better, because that's not the case. What I'm putting this out there as is there is this new theory about how to treat grief that matches how I experienced grief, and I want to share it with you all. So what this focuses on is, how do you help people manage, and again I say the transition from a physical relationship to one where you have a relationship that incorporates your memories and incorporates that person into your future. Because we're never going to lose our memories, right? And that person still exists for us in our memories. Christopher still exists for me. He is right there, right by my side. I think about him on a regular basis. No, I can't hug him. No, he can't talk back to me. But it doesn't change the fact that I believe that he's there. And that's the most important thing, is believing that he is there. And so I have attempted to develop a new relationship with him. And that's what continuing bonds is all about. Is that it's helping us transition from our past memories into our current reality. And it's kind of, if you think about it like as a bridge, right? We talk about our pets crossing the rainbow bridge. Well, this is us moving from a very physical relationship to a relationship that exists in our memories. And they call it object permanence. I believe that's the word I'm looking for. But anyway, inside my head, I have an internalized representation of Christopher, which he's kind of permanently like inside my brain. And so when I think about him, I call upon, and it's a memory, right? But it's a memory that I hold in my head, that exactly what he was wearing, his smile. And when I think of him, I go right to that image. And that's always in my head. And I would never talk about it before, because people would tell me, you got to let it go. You got to move it on. And that's just never worked for me until I got to this point where I had to decide, am I going to stay in what I know is working for me, this continuing bonds, or am I going to accept what society told me to do? And I decided to go out on my own. Now, some people, that's too hard and too painful, so they'll stay with trying to cut those ties to their deceased loved ones, because that's what therapists will tell them. That's what society tells them. But you don't have to do that. So I love this continuing bonds idea. Now, are people trained in the continuing bonds? Are therapists trained in the continuing bonds? My guess would be no. And I'll tell you why I think that. Now, granted, I went to school clear back in 2001, but these grief theories had been around for a long time. And I got a degree in marriage and family therapy. You would think that we would talk about grief, but I did not learn about grief. I didn't learn about grief theories. Kubler-Ross was out there. She's been out there for years, and society talks about her in great detail. So I didn't know about the other ones, not until Christopher died. And I was appalled. So then I was like, when I wrote my book, I decided to go and look at the CACREP accreditation, which is the monitoring body that says counselors will be educated in this, and this. Grief is not on there. It's an adjunct or something that they added on. And they said, well, if you have time, this would be a good idea, but it's not a requirement. And now after COVID, especially after COVID, where we've had this massive loss of people, I hope they change that. And some of the courses were part of, say, lifespan development, they talk about grief just a little bit. So when you go to a therapist, just understand that they may not necessarily know. So you find yourself in the position of educating them. And if they're accepting of you, there's no problem of that. There's no problem if you go to a therapist and they're willing to accept what you're saying. The problem comes in if you're going to a therapist and they tell you you need to move on now. There's something wrong with you because you still talk to your deceased loved one at the graveyard. All that does is forces people to stop talking to you. And that doesn't help at all. And if you have to go around hiding the fact that you want to continue a bond with your deceased loved one, then there's something wrong in our society. And also, this theory for me takes into question the diagnosis of complicated grief disorder. So, complicated grief disorder says that basically the person hasn't moved on for their grief. They're still wrapped up in their grief. Well, when I think about the fact that I am 12 years in and still struggling with my grief, I 100% believe that they would diagnose me with complicated grief disorder. However, if we look at this continuing bonds theory, it's like they're both contradictory statements. If I'm going to continue a bond with my deceased loved one and talk about them as if they're real and do all of these rituals to include them in my life, if I went to a therapist and they told me that, they diagnosed me with complicated grief disorder when there's nothing complicated about it. And I try to keep in mind that complicated grief disorder is about payment, so people can get the help that they need, so they have to have a diagnosis. I just don't think we should stigmatize people. And the other question that I have, that I say to myself, is I wonder if women are more proportionally diagnosed as having complicated grief disorder than men, which then would make it a gender bias issue. And I haven't researched that much. And so, yeah, I just wonder about that. So in summary, this whole idea of continuing bonds is that the person has moved to another location, another room. They're not completely out of your life. And I think that there's some people that might struggle with that kind of idea due to religious teachings. But if you can pray to a God and a God hears you, why would that same concept not apply when you're talking to your deceased loved one? For me, it does. So when I talk to him, he can hear me. When I pray, God can hear me. So there you go. And so we have been conditioned, though, to think that talking to yourself or talking to something that isn't there, that there's something mentally wrong with us. And that actually happened to me the other day. I was just talking away to myself in my room, and someone says to me, "Oh, you're talking to yourself. We need to get you some mental health therapy." And I just kind of laughed. They were just teasing me. But at the same time, that was kind of a rude thing to say, because I talk to myself doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me. And we've talked about this before. I'm a verbal processor. So yeah, I talk to myself. And if you see people talking to yourself, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with them. So if you want to look that book up and do some more research on it, I would read the book. Again, it is Continuing Bonds, A New Understanding of Grief by Dennis Glass, Phyllis Silverman, and Steven Nickman. Read it and leave me your thoughts. Let me know what you think. I know that it has been, even though I didn't know about this theory until recently, I know that that has been the most helpful thing for me. And what would change So like, and I ask this all the time, and you can leave comments on my Instagram or send me an email, but what changes for you? If you could believe, and maybe you already do believe, but if you could believe that your deceased loved one could hear you, that they still played a role in your life, that they were there for important events, at least in spirit, how would your grief change? What would change for you? And if it changed, what would it look like? Would it be supportive? Would it not be supportive? Would you adapt better? And what in your thinking process would have to change? Because, people always worry about, as I've heard at work, those woo-woo theories. Our psychologist would tell me that this continuing bonds is a woo-woo theory and not worth paying much attention to. But I work with a lot of people that have lost people, especially due to COVID, that are really struggling about how does this person become a part of my life. And I will tell you that I have a friend, not a client. I want to make sure you understand that. She's a friend. And her way of coping, as she imagines her son sitting right next to Jesus, and she still talks to him, she still has a relationship with him. So it's not like he's coming out of heaven to be with her. She envisions that he has the ability to be in both places at once. So if that helps anyone out, keep that in mind. And that, again, was just her looking at this whole idea of how do I manage the fact that my son died. She lost a son too. How do I manage that? Her son died due to a different way of dying, a very painful one. And it's like, how do you navigate that? And that was her way. There are other ways that you could think about doing that. Some people believe that you can call upon them. In fact, that's one of the things that I recommend when I'm working with someone that has died is, so if this person was a support system for you and you're really struggling at this moment in time, how come you don't call on them and say, I just need your help right now? Chances are some memory is going to pop into your head of something that they would say that would support you in that moment. And you'd be like, oh yeah, she used to say this, and it's a memory. And then that memory gives you warmth and it gives you support. And you're like, oh yeah, she gave me these teachings, or he gave me these teachings that I still can use in my present day life, even if they are not here. So that's another thing to think about too, is that all the things that this person taught you and all the love that they gave to you just doesn't go away because that person died. But it feels like it, right? Because we can't hug them and we can't speak to them and we can't pick up the telephone, and there's so many things that I wonder about, as opposed to what would it be like? And I know for me, I will have these moments of just understanding that he's around, or that something's been done, or make me laugh because it would be something that Christopher would have done because he's a jokester. And then I get to see, his daughter grow up and wonder about her too, if she has the same kind of sense of humor that Christopher had, and he was just really funny. But he lives on in the laughter. He lives on in our memories. So it just doesn't have to be the end, I guess, is what I'm trying to say to you. It feels like it in that moment. It feels like it. and you're in so much pain at first. And I've had people ask me, what does it feel like to lose a child? And I just can't describe it. Because grief doesn't qualify it, and I get annoyed. And I shouldn't get annoyed. But they talk about grief over losing a job. And yes, you do go through something. And if you want to call it grief, that's fine. Or bereavement. Okay. Or mourning. But none of those things match how I feel. None of them. It was so deep and life altering. I was in that moment, I was changed forever. And I knew it. I maintain that I felt my soul ripping when he died. I heard the ripping noise. I heard it. Was it my heart ripping in half? I don't know. I blacked out. I was no longer physically present in this world. The world was black. And he was gone. Just like that. And I can't even imagine. And I have written grief books. I have read grief books about other women that have had that same experience. And I'm so grateful to them that they agreed and allowed themselves to put that on paper. So those of us that went through it, we would know that we weren't alone. And I think that's the most important thing for me. And I hope that's the most important thing for the people listening, is that you are not alone. It feels like it. I promise you, I know it feels like it, especially if they were your only child or if you were a single parent. It feels like you are alone. But there's a whole community of us that have an intuitive understanding, which means you don't have to tell us. You do not have to tell us. But we get you. And so if you want to continue a bond that you have with your deceased loved one, I get you. I got you. If you have any comments or feedback regarding the podcast today, leave them on my Instagram, Grieving Insomaniacs. I don't check my Gmail very, very much, so it's much better to reach out on Facebook or Instagram, and I'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.